do a slightly more formal introduction. So just a few words about Barry. Barry Knight is a social scientist and statistician by background. He's the author of Rethinking Poverty, What Makes a Good Society, and was the director of the Webb Memorial Trust. Barry has written books on economic development, family policy, inner cities, the voluntary sector and social enterprise, and has extensive knowledge and expertise in methods to combat poverty. So I'm delighted to have this time to hear from Barry, and please do put your questions in the chat to make the most of this opportunity to have a discussion. So I'll stop there and hand over to Barry.
Thanks, Chris. When we were discussing this, I said I'd really like to have a participative discussion of that, which is not easy when we've got a large crowd and we're all not in the same room. But I do hope we can do that, because it seems to me that responding to the crisis and planning for the future in the context of poverty is, to say the least, daunting at the moment. And I can't pretend that I've got the answers, because nobody does. So I would like to hear from you about the answers to three questions that when I talk, and I'm going to try and keep this down to about 20 minutes, is to what extent do you agree with what I'm saying? The second question, I think, after, if we spend 10 minutes on that first question, and then maybe 15 minutes on how are you and your organization intending to deal with the crisis? Can we get some data from the field that would help us frame this? And thirdly, how can we use what we learn through the process of dealing with the crisis to think about how do we develop a society where everyone has the opportunity to live flourishing lives, because it's clear that at the moment they don't. I shall be writing up this session and sharing it with you on rethinkingpoverty.org. .uk. Check out that website for that. I'll also be sharing what I write with Chris, so he can share it through the networks. And I'd like to start from the position where we seem to be, which I think can only be described as despair. John Harris, writing in The Guardian today, is talking about that. There was a podcast I think very relevant, by the King's Fund on the 2nd of December last week, which brought together people like Torsten Bell and Helen Barnard from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others, which was showing how really this is catching everybody out, that nobody has got the answers to this, the answers to rising destitution. And I think it's really important, though, that we don't allow that fear and that sense of despondency to dominate our thinking about this, because if you think about a football team, if it goes in thinking that it's despairing, it's bound to lose the match. So we need to find hope. And I mean, Gordon Brown, I thought, wrote a really important article on the 7th of December, where he basically talked about, let's avoid getting into a doom loop, because in a way this crisis brings us to actually facing some deep-seated problems in our society, which we haven't been ignoring for too long. Although there is, no magic key, we are blessed as human beings with, a very creative moral imagination, and that we have not been using that sufficiently to think about the problem of poverty, to take a sort of long-term perspective. I mean, there has been no time ever in where we have made the bottom quintile of people on the lowest incomes to a standard where they could live a civilized life. And that has to be a stain on our society. And in 1930, J.M. Keynes, the economist, wrote a piece in which he said that economic growth would, by the year 2030, lift everyone so that we could all be without the servitude of labor, as he put it. And we've shown that's completely wrong, and that economic growth, far from actually lifting us out of poverty, is actually contributing to our collective destruction. We've known that for 50 years. The work of Donella Meadows on the environment, limits to growth, is 50 years old, and we've chosen not to take account of that, and the crisis has been gathering. One thing we had managed to do for the most part of the 20th century was to fulfill Beatrice Webb's 1909 prediction to say that we can get rid of destitution. But in the past 10 years, we have been actually seeing, according to Joseph Rowntree Foundation statistics, the re-emergence of destitution. And the trajectory of food banks in that time actually shows you what that has been like. And we are facing the consequences of long-term economic exploitation and actually the failure of social policy and practice to deal with underlying issues. And it was that brought me to write the book called Rethinking Poverty, published by Policy Press in 2017, and to come to terms with the fact that we actually do need a different way of being. And Adam Tooze wrote a book called Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World, shows the long-term effects of that crisis and how it changed everything. But we chose to patch that system. We didn't actually take the opportunity to think about where we'd got to in 2008 and change things. Then we got the pandemic in 2020, and I wrote an article which went viral there called Build Back Better. I said that this was an opportunity for the pandemic, which took us into the Lyman, a zone of confusion, which was an opportunity for root and branch reform, which would root out the rottenness in every aspect of the system. And for a brief time, there was a campaign called Build Back Better, which postulated a much more progressive society where we focus not on economic growth, but on flourishing lives. But actually, that was taken over, and that phrasing, which went viral, the weakness of a meme, was taken over by Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, and others, and they meant something completely different about it. And yet again, the governments are now patching, and we are seeing the consequences of that patch as we collapse into a world of dystopia, racism, inequality, misogyny, crime, and violent conflict. 1/4 of the globe now is actually characterized by war. And in our communities, I was talking to a young policeman last Saturday afternoon, where he was working in Sunderland, where he was talking about growing lawlessness and how the police are mostly dealing with mental health issues and domestic violence, and not got much time to actually work on what they're supposed to be doing about solving and preventing crime, because society is falling. We are actually on the verge of collapse, and I think if that is contributing to the despair, but it is the opportunity where we can actually begin to think about how to change things. Now, the economist Stuart Lansley has identified 4 conditions for the transformation of underlying paradigm of how a society works, which is what we need. We need root and branch reform. We need a different way of thinking about this. The 4 conditions he identifies are economic shock, the collapse of systems, and the collapse of trust in institutions. And we have those 3 conditions. What we do not have is a ready-made narrative, which is his 4th condition. What kind of society do we want? And we really need to think about how we construct a progressive narrative that actually deals with the deep-seated problems in our society, because you can't open a newspaper these days without actually asking somebody asking the question, where is the narrative? Because we tend to be very good at criticizing the system, tending to express outrage, but we're much less willing to actually create the kind of overarching framework that would actually lift us out of this thing. And progressives tend to think about small scale projects, but these are never joined up and they never inspire a new vision of society. So I have been in our work, there's a group of us working on this, not just me, but a whole collective of people thinking about the shorter term, the longer term. And we're taking inspiration from Buckminster Fuller, who in 1970 said, you never change something by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And that takes us into where we need to go. And of course, that's difficult because you go straight into complexity of finding a new social structure and developing economic management systems that actually work. And that brings you straight into conflict with the vested interests, with the people who do not want change to happen. And so, in a sense, as we face this crisis, I think we have to realize that actually the cavalry is not coming. I gave a talk in Blackpool in 2019, in which the chief executive of the council said, you know what, we're on our own. We have to do these things without help, because governments across the world have realized that they cannot change the systems and that they are much more interested in hanging on to power or getting power rather than thinking about how society should work, because there is a sense in which they realize that there are not the resources to do what is needed to actually get us out of this mess. So in a sense, if change comes, and this is true of the short-term effects, because an interview with 3 council leaders on Sunday morning on the Politics show in the North, from Gateshead, from Newcastle, and Northumberland. Each one of them said, we have no extra capacity to deal with this crisis. So it is civil society that actually will need to be the activator of whatever happens. And I've been doing research in local areas, and what you can see is immense creativity at the grassroots. Last week, we celebrated something called the Jeanette Curtin Darling Prize, in which was 7 shortlisted applicants were designed from community level, designed to change systems using a shift the power approach in mental health, institutional racism, supporting migrants, building a new social economy, and dealing directly with poverty. And they differ very much from the ways of working that official agencies work. Rather than working from a bureaucratic base, they start by listening. They offer peer support. They are warm and friendly to one another. They focus on the survival of marginal populations in tough times and go the extra mile. And that strata in society is largely invisible. And in a sense, we need to build that power of that community. And we saw what happened in the pandemic. It was ordinary people who were the real heroes and heroines of this, not the politicians and not the people who ran the systems. It was people who stepped in. And if you think about E.P. Thompson and the making of the English working class, he starts with that book with 2 fallacies. From the right wing, ordinary people are seen as economic fodder, part of the economic series that it designed to produce economic growth. From the left, ordinary people are seen as victims of an oppressive system who are actually at the bottom end of capitalism. Neither of those analyses gives people agency. And this is actually a moment where we really need the local people to support them in activities. And if you see, and I don't particularly like food banks, but that's on principle. In practice, they are actually lifelines, because those people, in people we have in Newcastle, for example, a food bank which is made up largely of people from Newcastle United football supporters who give money every week. These are ordinary folk. We need to build that out of that compassion that ordinary folk have, that is sadly lacking in our politics. The politics of the welfare state was driven by a complete error that was the gentleman in Whitehall knows best. That comes from a 1936 book, and it informed how the welfare state was organized. And Beveridge himself resisted the idea that the welfare state should be top down. He felt it should be run on a mutual aid principles by friendly societies, and that that would actually bring a kindness and a compassion into systems that is frankly absent in our in our cold bureaucracies, that you see in I. Daniel Blake and other kind of portrayals of the system as it is. We need a complete rethinking of who we are as human beings, to actually get in touch with ourselves, to face our shadows, to get in touch with our warm and compassionate nature, and begin to end the hate and bitterness that is driving our politics and spills over into our public sphere. We need to model that, so that in a sense that there is a transformation of power within this country. Because if you think about the Brexit vote, which has caused so much self-harm, as we're now seeing, it's not just the cost of living crisis we're facing, it's the cost of leaving crisis, as Judith Curtin-Darling put it on BBC television on Sunday. This is about a transformation that needs to start with ourselves. We need to actually begin to think about who we are as people and take responsibility, because the careers of bureaucracies, as we know them, are coming towards a crisis point, and we are going to have a different kind of way, and we need to build that now. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Thanks for setting that scene. And we've got the first question has just popped into the chat from Andy Meakin. It's saying, to what extent has the political divide contributed? Sorry, it lost me there. So on the right, we have the idea that people make their own destiny, and that inequality is a function of worth. On the left, we have the idea that inequality is entirely structural and the product of injustice. Is Gordon Brown right that this is driven by the institutions and isn't driven in part by the electoral system that creates a 19th century competitive landscape?
Yeah. Well, I mean, all of those comments draw on the same kind of paradigm. It shows how the old paradigm is completely out of date. I mean, the first past the post voting system, I mean, I don't want to lay the blame at any particular political party, but they are both trapped by this system, which actually people vote for they often vote for the least worst option. And there is this kind of center, the politics is now, there is almost no real difference between the parties, because they're all accepting the system as it is, whether it's Brexit or the underlying desire for economic growth. It is clear that economic growth has led to this crisis. It is not the salvation for this crisis. Otherwise, Keynes would have been right in his 1930 prediction. And of course, inequality is structural, and it is driven by the institutions, where you've got people at the top of the system who are running the systems and people who are beneficiaries of the system, and that in itself creates an inequality gap. The provider beneficiary approach, which would have been avoided had Beveridge had his way, in which he didn't want a welfare state. He wanted a welfare society. He was very explicit about that and wrote towards the end of his life about the disappointment in the system. And as early as the 50s and 60s, people were rebelling against the system, feeling it was completely unfair. That in the 1960s, there were claimants unions, which were talking about the oppressive state. So in a sense, one has a bitterness that is which is come from a certain worldview that there are some people who provide and some people who receive, where actually we should all be giving and getting through things, and politics has tended to become a professional sport where I mean, I can't watch Prime Minister's Question Time anymore because there's nothing sensible ever said. It's always just scoring points without any real substance. And I can see nothing in the current policies of the parties. We don't exactly know what they are, particularly on the Labour side, which actually will take account of the seriousness of the situation we face.
Thank you. And I'll nip back up to another comment from sorry, Shelley, I think. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. And what do you think of the notion that the situation we are in now is intentional, and to pave the way forward for a WEF style way forward? Sorry, final second bit. What to what extent do you think this is situation is intentional, or for the notion that it's intentional?
I don't have the data on whether it's intentional, but it's certainly happening. And some people say, of course, that Naomi Klein particularly formulates the view of disaster capitalism, whereas if you crash the economy, it's great for capitalists who can pick up assets very, very cheaply. Whether that's a dynamic, I'm really not sure, but this is certainly the effect of what's happening. I wonder, Chris, whether we should think about, asking people whether they've got solutions that they're working on locally in their particular circumstances, because it would be good to hear from what people are kind of thinking might be the ways out of this problem.
Yeah, so everybody, please post responses to that question in the chat as well, and I'll flick back up to a comment from Alex, sort of relates to that, saying that the largest impacts are usually made at the local level, and the greatest impacts when the voluntary and public sectors combine to empower local people. So that's one.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Duncan's question, I think, is interesting. Where did the big society get right and what was wrong? I wrote an article in 2012 in the New Statesman, which basically said if the big society had been called the civil society, it would have been made a lot more sense. But the big problem with the big society was that there were no resources behind it and no support from it, and things do happen spontaneously. And studying stuff at the grassroots of our societies, both in Tyne and Wear and in Hull, and I also hear in Stoke too, there is another force emerging, but we do not see it because often the commissioning systems do not allow for the rather creative and community-based solutions that don't have particular service categories attached to them, that they work across many different boundaries at once, whether it's institutional racism or mental health or parenting support, that in a way a holistic approach that's often taken at community level, where people are surviving and helping each other to thrive, is not seen by the system. So a big task that I see and want to contribute towards and would welcome help from others is actually how do we lift up this sphere? Much larger wealth taxes, definitely. Yeah. Well, I mean, Piketty and others have talked about the vitality, the vital role of taxation. I mean, when you look at the four factors that actually drove the success, the Les Trente Glorieuses in the 30 years between 1945 and 1975, high tax was one of the success factors because it enabled a social wage where services were free at the point of delivery. The other factors, of course, were full employment and decent wages, and all of those four conditions have been destroyed by the neoliberal ethic, which is to cut costs wherever possible, to cut wage rates, to cut welfare, is basically a model which is based on the survival of the fittest. And that means that certain people do really well. So, I mean, we should certainly be thinking about taxation policies, which are far too lax for people on higher incomes. We should also be thinking about how we reorganize services so that they are much more mutually aid based. Where, I mean, one of the projects that we rewarded in the Jeanette Curtin-Darling Prize was about mental health, people with mental health issues, working with people with other mental health issues on a peer group basis with a clinical psychologist in support, so that professionals become supporters of what local people do rather than controlling.
We've got a couple of comments from people. So Charlotte Smith says she worked for a local charity, and what is he time and time again is short-term ad hoc programs. So there's something about the commissioning of programs or services that are just too short-term, and that creates problems in itself. And then below we've got a comment about an organisation giving winter hardship grants to staff, used building assets and communities for warm spaces, adding campaigning voice, setting up social supermarkets. So there's quite a lot of there's things coming through there where I guess voluntary sector might be going over and above to pay for the cracks that are created by a system that's failing to some degree.
That's what the voluntary sector does, and it's what it's very good at. And it is protean; it changes shape, it adapts, and you saw that in the response to the food banks, which were all volunteer, often church-based or religious institution-based. And actually, warm spaces, is another one. The point about short-term, that exactly right. If you look at the history of regeneration, the number of different schemes since the Social Needs Act of 1969, from City Challenge through to task forces, through to urban development corporations, all similar things, but always changing the rules, that nobody ever gets to actually any kind of stability in the system. And somebody said charity is the result of a failed system. Absolutely right. We shouldn't have charity, but what else have we got right now?
There's some questions there about other countries that may have got it right. So Netherlands, Sweden, have they got it right? Somebody else has said they're interested in Japan's tax model based on people only having 24 hours of labour possible in any one given day. So yeah, any examples from elsewhere, Barry, that you can sort of reflect on?
Well, the Scandinavian model is often held up as a really successful one, and it worked for many years, particularly the high tax, high welfare kind of model, where people who were unable to work were not penalized with low incomes. And I mean, of course, Beveridge was at fault. His committee actually set the levels of subsistence actually at that, so people could never actually rise above. So I mean, there are examples, and we tend to forget. I mean, one of the crazy paradoxes, we talked about the developed world and the underdeveloped world, which came from 1949 Truman's speech around framing the task of international development. We would not be having this conversation in Africa because of the principle of Ubuntu, and where people actually, I am because you are. people actually help each other through immense hardships. I did a study some years ago of South Africa where everybody gives, everybody helps their neighbor, everybody, it's part of the culture. And they help in money, they help in time, and they help in goods in kind. There are many parts of Central and Eastern Europe where as the communist system actually retreated, people have stepped forward and formed community philanthropies in places like Slovakia, for example. There is a Healthy City Foundation, which is run by local people and actually gains all sorts of resources, has a model of empowering local people. In Russia, there is a network of 80 community philanthropies where businesses, civil society groups, and administrations have come through to build the assets, capacities, and trust. The assets, the financial resources, the capacities, the agency of people to do things, and trust, the relationships between people. To actually form a new bottom-up way of doing society. So we cannot be looking for authorities to take the lead at the moment, but we need authorities to change themselves from a delivering paradigm into an enabling paradigm, to open up spaces where people can step forward and help one another.
There's an interesting question from Ishani saying, what's your thoughts on the creation of that plausible alternative narrative? And how's that possible when they're in a landscape where social media and the internet has created an information marketplace that is quite disorientating and has a short attention span?
That's very important point. And the narrative tends to be very negative. And George Lakoff, the neuroscientist, has shown how that negative narrative actually does damage. And it does damage campaigning, negative campaigning. Poverty is bad, we should get rid of it, is language that does not cut through to anyone. One needs to have a positive framing of a narrative. And that was I wrote about that, the reasons for that, in Rethinking Poverty. And at the moment, what we're doing is we are co-creating narrative rather than me sitting in my office where I am now, actually thinking, who has said this and who is that? And can I actually write a paper about the narrative of a good society? This morning, I was on a call with 12 people from various parts of the world saying, what kind of society do you want? So we're crowdsourcing a narrative, beginning with people from all over the world saying, what are the systems that would actually work? And we did that with, we found, various participative research. We found that there were 5 in Rethinking Poverty, which we're deriving, that there were 5 kind of key components of a positive narrative that really cut through with people. We road tested this on how people received messages. And the 5 interlinked principles of a good society were: 1, a decent standard of living; 2, a sense of security and safety; 3, freedom to be creative; 4, respectful relationships; 5, sustainable futures for the next generation. When we actually studied this, and we did both statistical analysis and a lot of focus groups, and we actually gave grants so people could write their own stuff, what really came out was that people didn't want to be very rich. They didn't want constant economic growth. Their aspirations were nearly all about social, family, leisure things. They wanted enough money to get by, and they wanted a bit extra so that they could buy the occasional treat for themselves. But what their real riches were actually in their relationships and their sense of capacities. And what society has done over the past 80 years since the Second World War has progressively stripped ordinary people of the capacity to do things. So that social media, as the questioner says, is an outlet for outrage and hurt. And outrage and hurt is not a good basis for actually planning a society. We need to actually acknowledge that, see that as part of our shadow, to work with it, but to actually say, okay, we know what you don't want, but what would help you? What would be the thing that and would enable you to live a flourishing life?
Thank you. And then got a couple of questions. So one is or it's a commentary about how it could be quite difficult to engage people who are higher up the economic scale to sort of engage and become active and do sort of become sort of community active folk, and also at the other end of the scale, how to get politics to be more representative of those near the bottom end of the scale and to engage. So it's two sort of different issues.
Both really important. And I mean, our statistical analysis showed that in general, the higher up you went on the income distribution, the lower you were concerned about poverty, quite obviously. And it's people actually, the South African study I was telling you about was that the people who gave most, once you control for income, were the people at the bottom end of the distribution. This is something that's a movement, or has to be a movement of people from the bottom who actually begin to actually take power and say enough is enough. And I think, if you see what's happening around strikes, there's a lot of conflict around that. But this is about ordinary people saying, hey, this system is not working for me. One can, and as the government starts thinking about strike legislation, they're going to fuel an anger, which is ordinary people, nurses, teachers, doctors, well, not doctors so much, but, railway workers, people who run the system actually saying, this is hurting. And actually, that is something. The Financial Times yesterday produced statistics which showed that the number of strikes in 2022 is greater than since any year since 1989. We're seeing the difference. We're seeing a move afoot. I think we're also across the world seeing communities coming of age, as in many countries in the world, the COVID pandemic meant that international government organizations left the field, like Oxfam and Save the Children. Governments couldn't do things. People stepped forward. They took into positions of power. That is going to reverberate through the system. And we should be encouraging people at the bottom of the system to actually develop a career path. I don't mean jobs, but I mean actually through encouraging community leadership into political leadership, because at the moment our politics is generally populated by people who have been to Oxford and done a PPE degree, not people who have actually been in Middlesbrough on a wet Wednesday night working in the Tenants Association. And they're the kind of people we need to actually, because they have got what used to be called blue collar sense rather than white collar sense. And we do not want to be ruled by a technocratic class. It's people at the bottom of the heap actually have compassion with each other in a way that people higher up don't have those kinds of feelings. So we need to build kindness, compassion, wisdom into our societies. And we tend to write off people because they don't have a university degree. Well, how crazy could that be?
And we've had a couple of comments in about universal basic income, for and against. So any reflections on that from you, Barry?
Well, I'm a strong supporter of universal basic income, and Stuart Lansley has done some modelling for Compass, which I'm co-chair of, in which he shows at a certain level it can really work, and it would simplify things. There are risks with it, particularly as if your income is dependent on a government that you might not trust. But it's got to be better than what we have at the moment, which is a mishmash of undignified benefits, people feeling as if they've got handouts from the state and they're second-class citizens. If we could integrate income and the tax system, raise income taxes and other taxes for those at the top of the distribution, and reduce them at the bottom, we could actually transform society from an income point of view. There's got to be the political will to do that. But I think that modeling basic income is a really powerful thing to do.
I suppose that links some way to a couple of comments relating to the economy. So Charlotte Smith is the economy is the people. Without the people, there is no economy. And a comment that we need those in authority to work on the assumption that the economy is there to serve the people rather than vice versa.
Oh, here. Well, I can't add anything to those comments.
Okay. Okay. Are you aware of the work of Nick Hanauer in the USA, and what are your thoughts about his economics, Andy Meakin?
I'm not, and I'd love to hear more.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could circulate my email, and people might want to, send me some thoughts or some kind of way of doing that. Put that in the chat. That would be really good. I'd like to follow that up. Thank you.
That was from Andy. Andy, I don't know if you want to jump in. I've just enabled your microphone if you want to make a comment.
Andy?
Hi, Chris. Yeah, thanks. Nick Hanauer is an unusual campaigner for equality in that he's a billionaire, and he was one of the people who first started Google. He was involved in Amazon, so you can just imagine how wealthy he is. But he's arguing in the States, he's putting a really powerful argument forward for radical increases to the minimum wage, and he's showing how that's benefiting the economy and leading to, more jobs and more entrepreneurship and more businesses, rather than the classical neoliberal argument that if labour is more expensive, you get less of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. I'm very grateful. I'll look that up. I mean, I know from Tyne and Weir that somebody's done a study which shows that we've been campaigning for the living wage, and some of both universities, Newcastle and Sunderland, are paying it, as is Sunderland City Council. And we calculated that that's put in 29 billion into the local economy just by paying people properly. That's the real living wage, not the one that Osborne, the real living wage through the Living Wage Foundation, which has come out of Citizens UK campaigning. So, lifting up campaigning of that kind would be another dimension. But thank you very much for that, Andy. That's great. Any other kind of positive thoughts that we could maybe draw on in the last few minutes, Chris? Suggestions like that we might follow up?
I'm just scrolling through. Comments again about how to get those people more politically engaged, those affected by inequality, but it's going back to the same what you've covered. So any more comments or things people want to put in the chat about the hope, the future?
Things that people are doing, practical things people were doing would be great to hear.
Patrick?
Yeah, could I just follow up on Ben's question about why do you think people that are most affected by inequality are often not politically engaged, and how can that be changed? I was really taken with the Brexit referendums where I lived in West Birmingham. My ward was a bifurcated differential. It was half between the wall suburbia and half a very deprived estate. And the turnout in the road groups on that estate in the local election immediately prior to the referendum was 15%, 15%. When we went to vote in the referendum, there were queues. I've never seen queues at this polling station before. And I said to my daughter, this is bad news, because these are people coming off the estate and they're voting Brexit because they think it's going to improve their lives. And the turnout on that estate was 85%. There was a bit of a lesson there for me that, this is a community that has been, and it's been let down by various politicians and the political process. But if we can engage the people who are the victims of austerity with an idea, with a principle, then there is some hope. And I thought during COVID, I really thought we were going to see a societal change here, because COVID showed us very clearly people who were most running a civilized were the low-skilled workers, and they were dying in their thousands because they were more exposed, and poverty and austerity increases their susceptibility. So I really thought that there was going to be a bright new future for public health, because people understood what public health was, politicians understood what public health was. And what happened was the Conservative government dismantled Public Health England in the middle of a pandemic and set it off into its component parts, when COVID showed us very clearly you cannot disentangle poverty and housing and diet from other aspects of people's health, and immediately introduced a 20% budget cut on public health. I struggle with this, Barry, and your presentation has been absolutely fascinating. Why aren't people outraged by this? I mean, you talked about those 4 conditions earlier: economic shock, system collapse, institutional collapse, which is what happened, and what sort of society do we want? And I don't see that emerging at a general level. And you also made a point about most people actually don't want to be filthy rich. They just want to be comfortable and have a nice life. But you also said something about people have been stripped of the capacity to change. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. But I have no idea how we achieve that. I mean, how do we get people the empowerment and communities the empowerment to be able to make those changes? I don't understand why most people aren't furious, incandescent with rage at what's happening to them. We've got infant mortality, the classic metric of third world poverty. It's a scandal that's happening in the third world. But for the first time ever since 2014, it's been increasing in this country. Life expectancy, which has been going up year on year on year on year since records began, that increase has stalled, and in some parts of my city, it's been declining. And nobody seems to, politically, nobody seems to think that this is anything other than just part of the natural order of things. I know it's a sort of philosophical question, but how do we engage with communities and people to give them the capacity to make change?
It's a really
8 minutes, Barry. You've got 8 minutes to come up with a solution.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I said at the outset I didn't have the answers, but I think asking the questions is the really powerful thing, and that's a really great question. And I don't have the answers, but I have seen organized communities, and I think that the organization of our communities is the really critical thing. Now, as one example of that, Citizens UK, in where I live in the Northeast, on a budget of 100,000, less than 100,000 a year, with 32 members of civil society groups, churches, mosques, schools, universities, secular community associations, others have built a power base within their communities by using those institutions, the membership of those institutions, to bring people to political assemblies. So when we were electing the North of Tyne mayor, 1,000 people filled a local theatre to ask the candidates what they would do. We need systematic attempts to actually organize people on low incomes, because it's not as if they're incompetent, it's they don't know the mechanism of how they can actually get involved. I think people are angry. I think people are hurt. They don't necessarily, but there's also a kind of death by 1,000 cuts, which you don't notice the next blow. As society sinks into this dystopia that I've been mentioning, it's just one, there's not a moment at which just when you think it couldn't get any worse, it does, but then you accept it, and then something else happens. It's this kind of kaleidoscope of unfolding challenge every day that people are just trying to get by and keeping their family going, getting the kids to school, taking Gran to the day center if there still is one. It's the struggle of daily life that people feel really. So I think in a sense, one hopes that this crisis will take us to a point where we can begin to join what unions are doing with what community organizations are doing, and basically saying enough is enough, because and actually influencing the political structures. I mean, at the moment, as I said, I'm part of Compass, and we're thinking about how do we build a progressive alliance of whether at least the more progressive parties begin to actually align some of their principles so that we can actually develop a new model of society. But I can only think it's going to be done by activism. People on this call, how can we actually co-create a narrative, which is one of the things I'm trying to do. I've got no monopoly on that. I'm completely open to different opinions. We can begin to build. The solution has to be collective, and we need, I think, what Neil Lawson calls movement generosity. We need to kind of get rid of our silos, diminish our egos, think less about our performance targets, and begin to think about how do we join up institutions across the piece to build power for ordinary people.
Thank you, Barry.
And just everybody's putting things in the chat. We're not enough time to get to everything now, but don't worry. But Barry, we are going to collate these, and Barry's going to use them in his write up of this talk as well. So your efforts are not wasted, and all contributions are much appreciated. Zafir, you've got your hand up. You've got a question.
Yeah. Hi, Barry. I'm just wondering if there's anything we can learn from the States. I read a really interesting book by, I can't remember it was written by an historian about poor people in America for the last 400 years. It was 400 years of white working class kind of families, and it's sort of and it's really in the sense that, and these people still vote against their interest after so many years of being deprived of owning property and etc., but they still kind of to this day vote against it. So the political system doesn't obviously work for them. I just wonder if there's anything we can learn from America and not to do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of how not to learn from America, but there also are some how to learn when you look at the reclaiming of some public spaces. For example, East Brooklyn was done by local African Americans working together to actually turn their community around. Similarly, you can go to the South Bronx these days, because similar things happened, whereas people actually in the South Bronx, there was the rape and murder of a nun where local people said, this has gone far enough. We have to organize. We have to work with get the drug dealers out of here. We have to work with housing providers. We have to build funds. We need to build our capacity. I think there are many things we can learn from other places. But we tend to be a bit, we're an island and we have an island mentality. And I think I've been working most of my life actually in the global south, and find that a much more comfortable place to work, where we tend to be hidebound by bureaucracy and elite self-interest.
Right. Thank you, Barry. Well, we've got 1 minute till to 1 o'clock, so I think we're probably out of time for more questions. But as I said, all the contributions you put in the chat will be considered. So thank you very much, and thank you for your attendance. And thanks above all to Barry. That was great stuff. Really insightful. Yeah, round of applause all around. And yeah, really good discussion. So thank you very much. I will stop recording now, because if I end this without stopping the recording, it may disappear.